economics is everything. Companies need to have a product and a business model that reaches scale. That does not mean that sort of government support is useless. I mean, it's certainly better than not having it, but fundamentally, companies need to be ready to compete on their own merits. I think many people in the United States will recognize Solyndra. Solyndra had a really cool technology. It was this kind of thin film solar panel doing copper indium gallium selenide or SIGs. Nobody else was doing that in quite the same way, but it was just way too expensive. It was a cool product, but they could not make money.
Hardware to Save a Planet explores the technical innovations that are giving us hope in the fight against climate change. Each episode focuses on a specific climate challenge and explores an emerging physical technology solution with the person bringing it into reality. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Hardware to Save a Planet. I'm here today with Pavel Molchanov, Senior Analyst at Raymond James. Pavel is one of the most widely followed voices in climate tech investing, and he's spent the last 20 years analyzing the companies, technologies, and policies shaping the energy transition. He has a pretty different profile than many of our guests, but after we first met, I was so impressed by his broad view and sharp insights, I wanted to have him on the show. Pavel joined Raymond James in 2003 and published his first research on renewables in 2006. So way before climate tech was a mainstream topic. He's recognized as a thought leader in the space, contributing to think tanks and policy forums, and regularly appearing on CNBC and Bloomberg to share his expertise. He covers everything from solar and hydrogen to carbon capture and battery storage, and he's known for really connecting dots between climate science, public policy, and market dynamics. So if you've ever wondered how Wall Street thinks about climate hardware, or what it takes for a climate tech company to attract serious investment, he's a guy you should definitely listen to. Pavel, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Dylan.
So before we dive in, as I said, you have a bit of a different profile and background from our other guests. I was wondering if you could give us a quick overview of your role at Raymond James. We mostly have founders and VCs on the show, so you're coming at this from a different perspective. What does a senior analyst actually do day to day, and how does your work influence how capital flows into climate tech?
Well, let me tell you, startups have the hard job. They actually have to create a technology, commercialize it, hopefully make money for their investors. All I do is write reports. Right, that's the easy part. It's like, is it harder to be a movie director or a film critic? Probably easier to be the critic. You don't actually have to make any films. So look, obviously, there's a lot sort of on the agenda always as it relates to kind of energy, climate, sustainability. I look at all of it. To clarify, I do not cover individual companies. I did at one point in my kind of earlier career. But at this point, I sit in our investment strategy group, and I just write about big picture trends, technological, political, regulatory, international, commodity prices, anything that touches on kind of the big picture of energy, climate, basic materials. So we can cover a lot of ground.
Yeah. And who's the primary audience for what you write?
Yeah, this is for investors. Fundamentally, this goes out to folks that are investing their kids' college funds, their pension funds, and hopefully we help them make some money. But sometimes all we can do is just provide information.
Yeah. So, like I said at the beginning, you joined in 2003 and you started covering renewables specifically in 2006. I was thinking about chatting with you today, I was trying to set my mind in that time frame, and I went and looked at a chart of solar production over the years. And in 2006, our solar production on this chart was so low that it literally wasn't even visible on the chart. It was like single digit terawatt hours globally, and now we're, I think, over 2,000 today. Like the so I thought it was I was it made me curious. Like what was kind of attracting to you to this space at the time, and was that kind of a really strange seeming choice externally, or now it makes a ton of sense. But what was that choice like at the time?
Right. I mean, Dylan, I think you nailed the basic kind of fundamental difference versus 20 years ago. 20 years ago, everything we're talking about under the kind of rubric of energy transition was experimental or so small that it just did not even measure up to anything meaningful. So you mentioned solar. I mean, global solar installations in 20 years ago when I started doing this were a few hundred megawatts, not giga, megawatts per year, right? I mean, you can find individual utility scale solar projects today that are hundreds of megawatts. Okay. At that point, that was the entire global market. Now, the flip side of that is we've had tremendous commoditization in the last 20 years. So volumes are through the roof, but the prices on those volumes have dramatically collapsed. Now, that's not a bad thing. I mean, it is if you're manufacturing widgets, right? You want high prices. But obviously, for energy transition broadly, we want this stuff to be cheap, and it's become vastly cheap. So 20 years ago, a PV module was $3 a watt. It was not the system, just the module was $3 a watt. Today, the global benchmark PV module price is 7 cents a watt. Okay, in the United States, it's higher because we have tariffs, so 20 cents. Right. So even on that, modules in the United States are 90+% cheaper than they were 20 years ago. And I would just say, like, what else in your life is 90% cheaper? Now, cell phones are certainly much better than what you could have bought 20 years ago, but they're not 90% cheaper, right? You maybe you pay the same amount, but you just get a better product. But here you get a better product because today's solar panels are vastly more efficient than 20 years ago. But it's also 90% cheaper. I'll give you another example. Okay, electric vehicles. There were zero commercially available electric vehicles 20 years ago anywhere in the world. There were, if you called up GM and said, can I buy an EV? There was no such thing. Uh, there were no Teslas commercially available. Maybe on like individual models, but it was a non-existent EV market. And today we have China, the world's largest EV market, where more than half of all the new car sales are electric. So I mean, it's night and day versus 20 years ago. But again, there are winners and losers, right? Winners would be the purchasers of all these amazing technologies that are cheaper. But again, if you're manufacturing and your product, you get 90% less, per widget, you
Right,
better make it up on volume. So
right,
it cuts
right,
both ways.
right. What what were you seeing back then? Because I mean, EVs weren't even a thing hardly. Solar was was so nascent. Did you, you know, was your prediction that this would become as big of a deal as it is today, and that's why you were getting in on it at that time, or what was the mindset at that time for you?
Well, it certainly was, was not the kind of consensus, understanding at that point, right? I mean,
Mhm.
in fact, the term energy transition, nobody used that 20 years ago.
Mm.
People called it alternative energy. Okay. I mean, that's how the lingo has changed. It was an alternative. There was sort of normal energy, and
Right.
there was this other kind of weird sort
Yeah.
of new energy. And, some people thought it was like it's a little toy that we can play with, but it would really not amount to much. And I mean, let me tell you, 20 years ago, the hot new thing in renewable energy 20 years ago was ethanol. That was the hot new thing, because in fact, this gets us into policy. One of the very first kind of, let's call them, climate pieces of legislation that the United States Congress ever passed was the renewable fuel standard in 2005. By the way, that was under a Republican president, George W. Bush, with a Republican House and a Republican Senate. They passed the renewable fuel standard 20 years ago. So ethanol was starting to boom, but yeah, nobody was shopping for EVs at that point. That's for sure.
Yeah. Does it I'm curious, like, that, like, the scale we've reached today 20 years later, and the adoption of EVs at 50% in China, or, new EVs sold in China being 50%, and how widespread and cheap solar is. It must have seemed kind of unfathomable 20 years ago to that we would reach that kind of scale, to some at least. I wonder if that the looking back and seeing how much progress we've made in those areas, does that give you hope or optimism about our ability to kind of continue to change and progress at such crazy scale?
Uh, it is absolutely true that just about all of these technologies have scaled more aggressively than the wildest predictions from 20 years, or maybe even 10 years ago. I mean, if you asked me 10 years ago, when EV sales were really just starting to kind of become meaningful, would China get to where half of their auto sales are electric by 2025? Is it 5 years? Let me tell you, 5 years ago, so middle of COVID, in the US, about 5% of auto sales were electric. And in China, 5% of auto sales were electric. Since 2020, the US went from 5% to 10. Okay, not bad. Uh, China went from 5% to 50. So just this decade, we've seen this quantum leap in Chinese EV adoption. By the way, China installs more solar than the rest of the world combined. China builds more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. I think one other thing worth keeping in mind is 20 years ago, there was hardly any government support for clean energy. I mean, just anywhere. I mean, it was not. Remember, Paris Agreement. That seems like ancient history. That was only 10 years ago. Okay, 20 years ago, there was not even the Copenhagen conference. Uh, that was at the end of the decade. So a lot of the initial progress, really early progress, was made with virtually, like we did not have an EV tax credit at that point. Well, again, there were no EVs, so we the U.S. was not subsidizing, carbon capture, was not subsidizing hydrogen. In Europe, we think of Europe as kind of leading the way in climate action, and it is. I mean, certainly compared to Washington, Brussels is vastly ahead. But the European climate law, which is kind of the umbrella policy for net zero in the EU by 2050, that's only about 5 years old at this point. So uh, a lot of these industries starting to make real progress without much of a push from governments, although governments certainly helped subsequently. But as we think about kind of what's going on in Washington right now, let's just keep in mind that uh, policy is not the end all and be all, and never has been.
Mm. So, which was definitely another question I had for you. Kind of how concerned are you about what's going on in Washington right now, uh, as it pertains to the future of our fight against climate change? It sounds like, well, yeah. What would you say?
Yeah, look, it it was obvious since last November's election that at the federal level, climate policy would sort of go into reverse gear under Trump 2.0, and indeed it has. That being said, we need to differentiate between sort of the sticks and the carrots. The most important policy at the federal level is in the category of carrots. So these are the tax credits. Some of these tax credits, are relatively old, but a bunch of them were only created 3 years ago under the Inflation Reduction Act. And when Congress was debating the new tax law this past summer, obviously this kind of issue got rehashed. I would say that considering how rough the outcome could have been, the actual outcome of what was included in the new tax law was on very much on the milder side of things. I mean, I'd say it was probably an 8 out of 10 in terms of like if the clean energy industry could have written its optimal bill, uh, they would not write that for sure. But I think they got probably 70 to 80% of what they could have realistically hoped for. The EV tax credit is going away. So if this video gets posted prior to September 30th, that is your deadline for buying an EV and still qualifying for this $7,500 credit. But just about everything else still has a pretty good runway years and years into the future. So solar and wind, and remember, or let's just put in context, the majority of all the new power plants being built in this country now are solar. Right? So more solar is getting built than all other types of power generation combined. For utility scale solar projects and wind, the deadline is July 2026 to start construction, and then 4 years to go through construction. So that creates a runway out to 2030 for wind and solar. Now, for nuclear small modular reactors that get a lot of attention because of the data center boom, that runway goes beyond 2030. But keep in mind, there are no nuclear reactors being built today in the United States. None. I mean, there are a lot of projects on the drawing board in the pipeline, but they're not physically getting built. So nuclear needs a really, really long runway because otherwise it just wouldn't make any sense. But solar and wind is getting built today and will continue to get built through 2030, at which point, whoever's in the White House at that stage and whoever controls Congress at that stage will be able to revisit this issue.
Right. Okay. That's quite a bit more optimistic than I was expecting.
Definitely not the sort of worst case scenario.
Yeah.
I'll mention too that there are aspects of climate policy that will meaningfully diminish under Trump 2.0, and those are the sticks, so the regulatory policies. So
Mm-hmm.
think about, for example, the EPA is going to revise its vehicle emissions rules. Uh, People can still buy an EV if they want, maybe no tax credit, but they're welcome to buy EVs. Companies can buy commercial EVs or buses. But there's not going to be the same regulatory push at the federal level from the EPA. And by the way, California and a dozen other states used to have their own vehicle emissions rules that were stricter than the federal rules. Congress repealed, this is what's called the waiver that California used to have. Now they're challenging it in court, so we'll see what happens. But as it stands, there is a common regulatory kind of policy across the board, and it's going to be weaker than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
There are some policies that are not going to change meaningfully, even under the EPA's authority. And a good example is the renewable fuel standard. So every year the U.S. fuel companies, refiners, petroleum retailers, are obligated to use billions of gallons of corn ethanol, as well as biodiesel or renewable diesel, and some cellulosic biofuels. So this is 2025 marks 20 years of the renewable fuel standard.
Mm-hmm.
And why has this policy been so bipartisan? I mean, it's very simple. Farmers are politically influential; they vote. There are some swing states. You could think of Minnesota, Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
maybe less of a swing state, but where the farm vote is quite powerful, and both parties want to get the farm vote, so they support the corn mandate, the biodiesel mandate under the renewable fuel standard. So in that regard, very little will change. I'll mention one other thing, and this is not specifically in the realm of climate policy, but it has a derivative effect, and that's tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
So we now have the highest weighted average tariff rate in the United States since the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff for people that remember their high school history.
Not me.
The question of, okay, tariffs, good or bad? Well, it depends on which side of the table you sit at. So
Mm-hmm.
if you are manufacturing widgets, solar panels, wind turbines, lithium batteries, then tariffs are great. If you are consuming those widgets, purchasing them, then obviously tariffs are not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
The I mentioned U.S. solar modules are 3 times more expensive than the world average. In fact, they were 3 times more expensive even before 2025, because we had actually the first solar tariffs in this country were imposed under the Obama administration. Then
Mm-hmm.
they were raised under Trump 1.0. They were raised again under Biden. And now, of course, we have, on top of those kind of industry or sectoral tariffs, we have country level tariffs that apply in different rates, to every individual country. So it makes solar more expensive. It makes EVs more expensive in the U.S. market. But again, it there are some beneficiaries. The companies that manufacture this equipment domestically certainly benefit from that. And the last thing I'll say on kind of the policy front, also somewhat of a broader theme than just climate. What's going on with interest rates? So interest rates are such an important driver of energy transition because everything we're talking about requires capital. Somebody needs to write a check to build, $1 billion solar farm. Somebody
Yeah.
needs to, if you're listening to this and you want solar on your rooftop and you want to sign a solar lease, somebody needs to write a check to finance the capex for your rooftop solar system, right? So you're
Hmm.
not writing the check if you're leasing it, but somebody needs to write that check. And all else being equal, lower interest rates are better for energy transition. Well, we now have uh, some of the lowest interest rates within the past 12 months. The 10-year treasury yield is right around 4%, which is roughly where it was in April during the peak of the trade war and all the kind of
Hmm.
drama around that. But at the beginning of the year, interest rates were a lot higher. Why? Because the economy has slowed, partly due to tariffs. And slower economy means the Federal Reserve will be cutting interest rates, and those treasury yields have anticipated that, and they've come down. So that is actually helpful from the perspective of energy transition.
I'm realizing as I'm hearing you talk, so much of what feels really important right now is about to what extent do policies and these kind of financial mechanics enable scaling of technologies that are quite mature, like solar and wind and EVs. Um, I'm curious. So much of what we focus on this show with our guests are really novel technologies that don't exist yet, that are kind of you know in the lab being developed in kind of early proof of concept stage or early piloting with early customers at super small scales. And I've heard the argument before that you know we shouldn't focus on those new technologies. We already have solar, we already have wind, we already have EVs. Like let's just put all of our energy and investment into scaling those. I'm curious from your kind of broad perspective on this. um, do you believe we have what we need to solve this challenge, or should we be continuing to invest in uh, you know deep tech novel solutions that don't exist today?
Yeah, it's never too much. Okay, we
Mm,
want more innovation, more R&D. That's always a good thing. Let's just put that on the table.
mm,
There are plenty of innovations taking place in energy transition that are incremental. So that EV lithium battery that can give you 300 miles of range today, can that get to 350 or 400? Great. The more the merrier, right? Uh, can it get to 1,000? That's harder, right? Then we would probably need solid state batteries. Solid state batteries. That's a science experiment today, right? You're not going to be buying an EV with a solid state battery right away. Perhaps by the end of the decade, if that happens, you could see EVs, with you know close to 1,000 miles of range. I mean, theoretically possible. Even beyond that, things that are completely experimental, right? Fusion. You know, people call it the holy grail, right, of energy. If we can have fusion power, okay, do not hold your breath for fusion power. So there are some very well-funded venture-backed companies working on fusion. There's an governmental consortium called the ITER in Europe
Yep.
that is getting billions and billions of dollars in government funding to build an experimental fusion reactor, but that's sort of 10 to 15 years out. That's I think certainly something we can watch. Electric aircraft. There are a few sort of test flights, but you're not going to be booking a ticket on an electric jetliner anytime soon.
Hmm.
Uh, is it important? Absolutely, right?
Mm.
Like aviation, so decarbonizing passenger cars, buses, and trucks. We've generally figured out how to do that. What about aviation? Right? I mean, for people to fly from London to New York, zero emission, that would be a big breakthrough. And again, that's not going to happen sort of within foreseeable future, but there are very smart people working on that
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
that problem.
Yeah.
There
What?
are. Let me touch on
Yeah.
on the kind of AI, because we
Yeah.
always
Please.
hear this. Okay,
Of
well,
course.
how is AI? So AI is both a problem to be addressed and a solution. Okay,
Right.
let me explain what I mean by that. So data centers, particularly the hyperscale data centers that are being built for AI applications, are notoriously gas guzzling. A hyperscale data center can use as much power as a mid-sized city, several 100,000 people. So we're going to need vast amounts of electricity to power those data centers. And in that context, in the United States, we now have power demand growing, around 3% a year. If we look at between the beginning of the century and 2023, so right before kind of that AI really began to scale, power demand was up about 10% over that entire period of time. So now it's growing 3% a year. Again, in large part because of AI. On the other hand, AI in the sense of the actual software capabilities, the analytics, can be an amazing tool to, for example, make the electric grid run better, reduce the prevalence of power outages, right? So instead of people sort of twisting a dial in a control room of a utility, right? You can write an algorithm that will kind of detect different mishaps on the grid or potentially even prevent them from happening in the first place. AI can also be used to analyze vast amounts of data in, for example, geological exploration for critical minerals. So we need lithium for those EV batteries and nickel and cobalt. Well, discover rare earths. We need to discover these minerals. AI can help us do that better and cheaper. So
Yeah.
AI has that kind of duality to
Yeah.
it, which is fascinating.
And maybe this is optimistic, but Um, is it is it true that much of the energy demand for data centers is being driven by companies that have, like Microsoft, that has kind of some net zero commitments and will do that in a way that actually increases demand for geothermal and other renewable energy that might actually accelerate the adoption and scaling of renewables? Or is that more kind of PR at this point, and it's not actually working that way?
So, because of how large scale electricity demand from data centers is, it really needs to be an all of the above strategy. And as with so much else, we have to look at geography. Right? It's not a one size fits all solution. So, as a lot of your listeners will be aware, the number one metro area in the world for data centers is Washington D.C., Northern Virginia. Uh, Land is expensive, and are you going to put a lot of solar farms next to you know $1 million mansions? Might be a stretch. I mean, there's certainly solar in Virginia and Maryland, but that's an area where natural gas is probably kind of number one for new source of electricity. When we look west of the Mississippi, where population density is dramatically lower, property is cheaper, right? Not to mention fantastic, sunlight patterns in the Southwest, and wind patterns in places like Kansas, or just sort of the Great Plains. There is a lot better use case for renewables. Geothermal, I don't think is ever going to be a giant power source in this country, right? You have to go to Iceland for that, or New Zealand. But geothermal is only west of the Mississippi, just the way the geology works.
Hmm. Until we get
And then
quasi energy
nuclear,
drilling super deep, right?
yeah, I mean, for geothermal power, you have to have particular types of rocks. I mean, it's the same reason why you're not drilling oil wells everywhere, right? There's a lot of it in Texas and North Dakota, but there's not a lot of oil in South Carolina, let's say. So with now nuclear can theoretically go anywhere. You do not need large amounts of area, right? And obviously, the uranium is mined in certain places like Kazakhstan, but you can ship it anywhere. The problem with nuclear is twofold, and this is why um, I think the role of nuclear in supporting the AI build out is probably kind of tends to be exaggerated. Number one is speed. Data centers need power not in 5 to 7 years. They need power tomorrow, right, or next year. And if we're talking about building a traditional nuclear reactor, like 1,000 megawatt reactor of the kind we've had for 50 years, that is not going to start operating until sometime beyond the end of this decade. Small modular reactors, could they be faster? Yes, but no one's ever built one. So it's a bit of a sort of speculating, right? A lot of companies are working on it. It's not a science experiment. It's just a scaled down version of a traditional reactor, essentially. But no one's ever built one. And so we can only guess how long they will take to build and also how expensive they will be. The second issue with nuclear is NIMBY, not in my backyard. So if we're talking about building nuclear on a military base, which the Department of Defense is looking at, that gets around the NIMBY issue. But if we're talking about building it, on private land or state land, then it's a safe bet. There will be community opposition in some places more than others, and that will need to be addressed. I just remind people that 20 years ago, when no one was talking about AI, but there was a plan to build a nuclear waste repository in Nevada. The federal government supported it, and it was ready to go. But the state of Nevada and the Las Vegas municipality sued. The issue got tied up in courts, and basically the project never got done. So with these SMRs, just keep in mind, in anything nuclear, there is going to be a challenge in getting that past the finish line. I mean, we saw that in Japan after the Fukushima disaster in 2011. They're not even building new ones; they're just trying to bring reactors back online, and even that has had quite a bit of pushback from segments of the public.
Yeah. I'm curious, you talk about some of these technologies that are earlier in their kind of maturity, like SMRs, or even the science experiments like solid state batteries or electric aviation. These are the kinds of projects that many of my guests are focused on. What lessons can we learn from the technologies that have scaled really successfully, like solar, or your example of 50% adoption or of new vehicle sales in China, or maybe lessons learned from ones that haven't successfully scaled in the last 20 years as you've been watching this. But what does can you distill any advice from what you've seen for people who are starting out that journey, like with the goal to scale new technologies that haven't reached that maturity yet?
Yeah, economics is everything. It, Companies need to have a product and a business model that reaches scale. Uh, that does not mean that sort of government support is useless. I mean, it's certainly better than not having it. But fundamentally, companies need to be ready to compete on their own merits. And let's just sort of think back to some of uh, the fails over the last 10 to 20 years. So I think many people in the United States will recognize Solyndra. Solyndra had a really cool technology. It was this thin film solar panel doing copper indium gallium selenide, or SIGs. Yeah, like nobody else was doing that in quite the same way, but it was just way too expensive. It was a cool product, but they could not make money. And at the time that Solyndra was trying to scale, China was already kind of starting to lead in manufacturing solar. Today China manufactures 3/4 of the world's PV modules. That was not always the case. 20 years ago, it was nothing close to that. But kind of around 2010, China really began to, Chinese manufacturers really bringing down cost, and Solyndra just could not could not compete with that, even with their kind of government support. Uh, there are some. So that was a failure of execution. There are other technologies where it was a failure, not so much of execution, but maybe a little more fundamentally. Just the underlying concept just did not pan out. An example of that is wave power. So
Mm-hmm.
some of you might be like, what's wave power? So imagine a buoy that bobs up and down with the motion of the wave in the ocean. And as that bobbing action takes place, that generates electricity. It's not a ridiculous idea, but there were, if we go back 15 years ago, there were a lot of companies. I'll particularly just say, this concept was really popular in those days in the UK and Ireland because they have some of the best waves just based on their geography.
Hmm.
Portugal comes to mind as
Hmm.
well. So you had all these startups, in Scotland and so on, and they tried to make these buoys that, and essentially none of them worked the way they were supposed to.
Mm.
So there's still a few remnants that are companies that are trying to do this, but I, I'm not sure that will ever work.
Mm.
Uh, Another area of disappointment over the past 10 to 20 years has been cellulosic biofuel. So the idea that you would take switchgrass, wood chips, or maybe best of all, municipal solid waste and turn
Yeah.
that into biofuel. So many companies have tried, and just one after another, it's just been really hard. The Especially with municipal solid waste, the consistency of waste is extremely variable, right? I mean, literally, you don't know what's in that batch of garbage that your plant brings in, and so building machinery that processes that has been extremely difficult, and essentially no one has cracked the code. Again, so many companies have tried, including some uh, names that like Kior and uh, Fulcrum Bioenergy that are not around anymore. So there have been disappointments, but I think the most important success stories have been across the board. Companies that have delivered on an economically viable business model. Uh, that does not mean, by the way, that the stock automatically goes up, because there is also commoditization. There's government policies can change, but as long as the essence of the business model is cost competitive, that's a great starting point.
Yeah. Right. It's not just about technically being able to manufacture cellulosic biofuel from municipal waste. It's about doing it in an economically, making the economics work. That's your point.
Well, the technology needs to work. I mean, obviously
Right.
that's the prerequisite. That's the prerequisite. If the concept does not work, if the technology is not valid,
Yeah.
okay, then it's
But you
like,
can't just you can't build a business on that,
right. I mean,
on just that.
think
Yeah.
of biotech, right? You got to make sure that the medicine actually cures the disease. Okay.
Right.
And then, assuming it cures the disease, you build the factory to manufacture it and so on. Same thing here. We want the technology validated and then to be commercially successful. So for companies that, for example, are working on electric aircraft, there's not really a question over, can you build an electric aircraft, right? That's there's no experimentation in that. It's, can you build it in a way that will be safe, that will be, cost efficient, and sort of can go the distance that it needs to go. So the technology is not the question, but execution. Same thing as it applies to all of these other kind of incremental innovations, like going from a lithium battery with 300 miles of range to 600 miles of range.
Right. Hmm. Um, I'm just watching the time. I know I've got to wrap us up pretty soon here. Is there anything you wanted to hit that we haven't yet covered? I have a couple more questions, but
Yeah, I think it's worth highlighting that uh, as as important as the U.S. economy is, in the context of energy transition, it has never been the end all and be all. And indeed, if the last 20 years have taught us anything, it's that um, different sort of points on the globe can lead the way when it comes to different technologies. So, 20 years ago, nobody would have guessed that China will become the by far the largest solar manufacturing source in the world, and also the largest place for solar installations. Right, 20 years ago, it was, people were focused on Italy as
Hmm.
as a solar market. And then, with, I mean, China is obviously sort of the, prime example now of so much in energy transition, solar, wind, batteries, nuclear, and so on. But there are other interesting things happening in other places. So in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we now have micro solar. So think of, like a single module that will generate solar for a small house, right, in a village that has no electric grid. So these micro solar systems in parts of Africa can be the only realistic way to electrify these communities. Right? We obviously do not have a problem with sort of shortage of electricity in the US or Europe, but in Africa, solar can be a great solution for that. India, uh, starting about 10 years ago, reached virtually full electrification of the country, with distributed scale solar playing a very important role in that. Brazil is the leader in bioenergy, not just taking sugarcane and turning that into ethanol, but think of all the scraps from like from the harvest that would otherwise get wasted. They're turning that into electricity. The sort of sorghum and the husks of the sugarcane plants, they're generating power using that on a significant scale. Offshore wind, as a little controversial these days in the US, but it's moving right along in the UK and in Denmark and off the coast of China. So just there are different places where different technologies have better use cases for different reasons. Obviously, geography or geology or different population patterns. And so I think it's really important to have a global perspective on this. And what we see as energy transition is alive and well.
yeah, and it's not. I if I understand right, your point is that it won't be a one size fits all solution where the whole world is driven on solar or SMRs or whatever. It's so dependent on local geography and geology and weather patterns and everything and economics that we'll end up the solution will look like a patchwork or a diversity of different solutions all around the
Yes.
globe.
Yeah. Yeah. All of the above.
Yeah. Well, I have 3 questions that I ask everybody at the end of every episode. This has been really fun, and I could definitely continue chatting for hours, but I got to be respectful of your time. So the 3 questions. The first is, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of the planet, and why?
After everything we've talked about, um, I'm pessimistic over a 30-year time frame, and maybe paradoxically optimistic over a 100-year time frame. When we look at all those net zero projections, they're not going to help us very much until somewhere between 2050 and 2070. And so for the next 1 to 2 generations, we pretty much know that the climate is going to keep on heating. And that's from if you look at the UN environmental program forecast, the 1.5 degree, we're pretty much at that point already. So the question is, will it be 2 degrees, 2.5, 3? I think if we can, if net zero is actually achieved sometime between 2050 and 2070, that creates a better picture towards the end of the century. Uh, but for the next 20 to 40 years, we're going to need to focus quite a bit on something that we have not talked about today, and that's climate adaptation.
Mm,
So,
mhm.
maybe a future episode. We'll
Next
just
episode, yeah.
let that be a sneak preview.
Okay. Well, that feels very realistic. Who is another company or individual doing something to address climate change that's inspiring you?
Well, there are, I mean, there are countless startups and almost countless venture capital funds that support those startups. But I would be remiss if I did not highlight Bill Gates and his breakthrough energy ventures. Uh, I am not aware of any other VC firm that has funded more climate startups than Breakthrough. If someone has different numbers, email me and I'm happy to be corrected. But as far as I know, Breakthrough has funded just numerically more of them, and I think that's having a massive sort of pool of capital that's available very specifically, very deliberately, focused on climate action along those lines has been a big help to so many company founders. So breakthrough, uh, you know, keep up the good work.
Yeah, totally. What advice do you have for someone not working in climate today who wants to do something to help?
As consumers, we were able to do just little things in our daily life. So you do not have to change your job or move halfway around the world. Uh, you can replace an internal combustion vehicle with an EV. And by the way, I always get the question, okay, but the community I live in gets its power from a coal plant. The EV is still going to be lower emission, even with that coal plant, than burning gasoline. That's just the way the math works. You can get solar on your rooftop. No, and again, this this common pushback. There's not a lot of sunlight. I live in Minnesota or Alaska. You can get solar on your rooftop and it's going to work. I mean, yes, it works better in Arizona, right? But photovoltaics, which is what we're talking about here, are designed to work practically anywhere, right? So they work in Germany, they work in the UK. They're going to work no matter where you live in the United States. And then this one's maybe a little less straightforward because a lot of people enjoy meat, but just putting this on the table, plant-based foods have a lower carbon footprint, all else being equal, than meat. So whether it's tofu or beans, or there are other sources of protein that are plant based. So this one again can maybe gets a little bit of getting used to, and so not for everybody. I get that, but something we can all do. So
Yeah. I love it. Pavel, thank you very much. I've learned a ton. I feel like I could keep going for hours, but I really appreciate your time.
Dylan, thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. To find out more about us and how we develop hardware solutions for the world's most ambitious companies, head to synapse.com. And then make sure to search for Hardware to Save a Planet in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you like to listen. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Synapse, thanks for listening.